There's a version of destruction so clean, so quiet, that the person being destroyed rarely realizes it's happening until it's already done. No raised voices, no visible damage, no single moment you can point to and say that's where it went wrong. Just a slow, calculated withdrawal of warmth, a gradual cooling of every connection that mattered, until one day, someone looks around and realizes that every real relationship they had is hollow or gone. And the most terrifying part? In most cases, they did it to themselves. This is happening to millions of people right now, in 2026, and most of them would describe it as just the way I am. Johann Liebert understood this better than anyone. His entire philosophy was built on one insight: that you don't need violence to destroy a person. You just need to understand what holds them together and quietly remove it. Trust, warmth, the sense that someone genuinely sees them. Take those away slowly enough, and a person will fall apart entirely on their own without you ever having to lay a hand on them. What nobody talks about is that an entire generation is now doing this to themselves, not because they're villains, because they've been taught that this is what strength looks like. Let's get into it. Here's what this looks like in practice, and it's probably more familiar than you'd expect. Someone decides they're done being affected by things, done texting back too fast, because that signals desperation, done admitting they're excited about something, because that invites mockery, done showing that a person matters to them, because the one time they did, it cost them. So they build a system. Carefully calculated response delays, message seen immediately, replied to 3 hours later. One-word answers designed to feel effortlessly cool. Heavy reliance on sarcasm and irony, so everything can be played as a joke if needed, and nothing ever has to be genuinely meant. A complete, polished aesthetic of unbothered indifference, maintained across every platform, every conversation, every interaction. And here's why it works. As a performance, people do perceive it as confidence, as mystery, as someone operating on a level above ordinary emotional need. But there's a tell that almost nobody catches, and once you see it, the whole thing unravels. Real indifference doesn't require a system. If someone genuinely doesn't care, they don't need a strategy for hiding that they care. The strategy is the confession. The performance only exists because something underneath it is being actively managed, around the clock, at a cost that's never advertised on any of the content selling this lifestyle. So what's actually underneath it, and where did the whole thing start? This is where it stops being a trend piece and becomes something more uncomfortable to sit with. In 2026, a significant part of what presents itself as unbothered confidence still traces back to something that formed long before anyone was old enough to have a social media account. It starts in early childhood, in the specific dynamic between a child and the adult who was supposed to be there for them. When a child reaches out, needs comfort, needs to be seen, needs someone to respond to their distress, and the caregiver consistently isn't available emotionally, something gets decided at a very deep level. The child doesn't conclude, "My parent is struggling." Children don't have the framework for that. What they conclude is far more personal. Needing people doesn't work. So they adapt. They stop reaching. They build a defensive self-sufficiency that isn't actually independence. It's a survival strategy constructed around the belief that no one's coming, so you'd better stop waiting. In modern households, this is happening at scale because parental burnout is at levels the country hasn't seen before. Exhausted caregivers, stretched thin by financial pressure and emotional depletion, withdrawing without realizing it, speaking less, withholding physical affection, making caregiving feel like an obligation rather than a connection. Nobody means harm, but the child has no way to interpret absence as anything other than a verdict about their own worth. The result, years later, is an adult who looks impressively self-contained, who can walk into high-pressure situations, showing nothing, who appears to need no one. And research shows something genuinely unsettling about these individuals. They often function extremely well on the outside, goal-oriented, composed, consistent. But when you measure their ability to actually understand their own emotional experiences, they score poorly. They can't clearly identify what they're feeling in a difficult moment. They're not regulated. They're disconnected. And those two things can look identical from the outside for years, until something finally cracks through the surface and there's nothing underneath it to hold. Now add social media on top of this, and the whole system doesn't just continue, it accelerates into something far more damaging. In 2026, social media platforms have effectively turned emotional vulnerability into a public liability more completely than at any point before. Every unguarded reaction is a potential screenshot. Every sincere moment of caring too visibly is one clip away from becoming content. Clinical psychologists have a term for this vulnerability: hangovers, the specific fear that any unmediated emotional expression can be archived, shared, and judged indefinitely. So people preemptively flatten themselves, not because they feel nothing, but because feeling something in public now carries a documented social cost that previous generations simply didn't face. A 2022 study confirmed what most people intuitively sense. Young adults are systematically modifying and suppressing their emotional displays online, consciously, to manage how they're perceived. By 2025, researchers were finding that teenagers no longer experienced acting unbothered as a personal preference. It had become a social requirement, a mandatory performance just to survive the daily scrutiny of being visible. And here's the specific mechanism that makes this so damaging. There's a crucial difference between how people actively use social media versus how they passively consume it. Active use, direct messaging, genuine back and forth tends to support connection and mood. Passive scrolling, silently watching other people's curated highlight reels without interacting, is consistently linked to increased envy, chronic rumination, and worsening mood. And most people's relationship with social media is almost entirely passive, just watching, comparing, measuring their own unpolished internal reality against an endless stream of other people's most confident, most apparently unbothered moments. That comparison loop doesn't produce genuine confidence. It produces pressure to perform confidence harder, until the gap between who you actually are and who you're presenting becomes too wide to sustain. While the external persona stays carefully curated and detached, the internal reality is intense anxiety, constant rumination, and a loneliness that's almost impossible to describe to anyone, because the whole point of the performance was that no one was supposed to see it. And the national data on where this ends up is quietly devastating. Around 40% of American students report persistent sadness or hopelessness. 1 in 5 has seriously considered suicide. Close to 1 in 10 has attempted it. These aren't people who look visibly broken in a hallway, in a comment section, in a group chat. They look completely fine, unbothered, in control. The mask is working perfectly right up until it stops working entirely. This is what quiet destruction looks like when you follow it all the way to its outcome. Not a dramatic collapse, just a slow, invisible accumulation of suppressed distress building pressure the body and mind eventually cannot absorb. And then there's what this does to relationships specifically, which deserves its own examination because it operates through a completely different mechanism. In 2026, modern dating has been reorganized around a single governing rule. Whoever shows the least emotion holds the power. The person with the most apparent indifference wins. The one who texts first, admits interest, allows any visible investment, loses leverage immediately. Dating apps accelerate this by presenting romantic options as essentially infinite, mimicking the psychology of online shopping. Because a better option is always theoretically one swipe away, any current investment gets weighed against its opportunity cost. The result is a chronic commitment phobia built into the structure of modern romance itself. So both sides play the same defensive game simultaneously. Both perform detachment. Both wait for the other person to move first. Both protect themselves so carefully from the possibility of caring more than the other person that nothing real ever forms. The connection stalls in that indefinite, non-committed limbo that an entire generation now has a name for: the failed talking stage, and collapses not from conflict, but from mutual paralysis. Nobody gets hurt. Dramatically. No fight, no confrontation, no clear ending. Just two people who were probably both genuinely interested, drifting apart because neither would be the first to say so. And both of them will walk away convinced the other person simply wasn't that invested, when the truth is, both of them were. They just built a system so airtight against rejection that it rejected the thing they actually wanted before it ever had a chance. To sustain all of this at a cultural scale, in 2026, the internet has done something remarkably clever. It turned the wound into an aesthetic. Rather than being recognized as a painful adaptation to neglect or fear, emotional detachment got repackaged as a prestige lifestyle. Sigma masculinity, dark feminine energy, the lone wolf archetype, the mysteriously untouchable main character, complete with personality frameworks that reframe avoidant deactivation as elite cognitive function. Your emotional unavailability isn't a wound, it's an INTJ trait. Your discomfort with intimacy isn't fear, it's strategic independence. Your inability to connect isn't damage from an early environment that didn't show up for you. It's a carefully chosen philosophical stance. This is the part that would be almost darkly funny if the outcomes weren't so clearly documented. Because what these aesthetics are glamorizing when you strip the branding away completely is a set of behaviors that clinical psychology has spent decades linking to depression, anxiety, cardiovascular strain, and the progressive collapse of a person's capacity to form real bonds with other human beings. Johann Liebert used quiet destruction as a weapon against others. The nonchalance epidemic has turned that same weapon inward, and the internet gave it a logo, a filter, and a follower count. So if the entire system is this well-constructed, this well-marketed, and this genuinely damaging, what does the exit actually look like? Here's the answer. And it's going to sound almost disappointingly simple after everything you just heard. It starts with sincerity. Not performed sincerity, not carefully managed vulnerability with one eye on how it's landing, just actual caring, expressed without calculating the return. Texting back when you're genuinely interested. Saying something was good when it was good. Letting enthusiasm exist without immediately covering it with a joke so you can deny it later. Sociologists studying this have started calling it the sincerity rebellion, the deliberate countercultural act of actually meaning what you say. In a culture that has built an entire economy around never meaning anything too visibly, it sounds small. In the current environment, it is genuinely radical. The clinical version of this is called cognitive reappraisal, and the distinction between this and suppression is exactly the distinction between actually being okay and just appearing to be. Suppression hides the emotional response, while the internal stress continues unprocessed underneath. The physiological arousal doesn't actually decrease, it just stops showing on your face. Reappraisal actually changes your relationship to the stressor. One delays the damage, the other begins to resolve it. And then there's the piece: this entire aesthetic was specifically constructed to avoid connection. Real, consistent, non-transactional human connection. The kind where someone shows up after you've been distant, where a conversation happens without either person performing for an imaginary audience, where vulnerability doesn't get immediately punished. Human beings are not built to function without this. The self-sufficiency that excludes connection entirely is not independence. It is an old injury, wearing independence as a disguise, still flinching from a rejection that happened long before anyone had the language to name it. Johann Liebert understood that connection is where people are most vulnerable. He used that understanding to destroy everything he touched. What his entire philosophy missed, the thing it could never account for, is that connection is also where people become genuinely resilient. Not armored, not numbed, not performing calm. Actually resilient. Because they have people who will still be there when the performance finally breaks. And the performance always breaks. The coldness always cracks through loss, through illness, through something that simply cannot be managed with delayed replies and practiced indifference. In that moment, the person who built real connections has somewhere to land. The person who spent years performing detachment finds themselves genuinely alone, surrounded by people who know the performance but not the person underneath it. That specific loneliness, being surrounded by people who don't actually know you, is one of the most painful experiences documented in psychological research, and it is entirely self-constructed. So here's where this actually leaves you. You've now seen the complete architecture of quiet destruction, how it's installed in childhood, how digital culture monetizes and accelerates it, how it reshapes romance into an adversarial game where everyone loses, how the internet turned a psychological wound into an aspirational brand. and how it ends not in strength but in an expensive, lonely performance that nobody is getting any real return on. The sincerity rebellion isn't a feel-good alternative to any of this. It's the only structural exit. And it starts, one small moment at a time, with the decision to stop performing and start actually showing up. Which leaves the obvious next question. If you've been doing this long enough that it feels like a personality, if the coldness has been there so long it feels like it is you, how do you actually begin to walk it back, practically, without it feeling forced or humiliating? That's exactly what the next video on your screen addresses, the real, step-by-step process of rebuilding emotional honesty when you've spent years training in the exact opposite direction. Click that next, because the most dangerous thing in your life right now, in 2026, isn't someone trying to destroy you. It's the version of you that's been doing it quietly, all along.